Welcome everyone. This is the third co-production conversation in the series that was never meant to be a series. We hope you've enjoyed the first two. We've loved your feedback and comments, and it's really encouraging us just to pursue some more interesting conversations about this idea of co-production. We're delighted to be able to welcome Anita to join the conversation today, and we'll start, as we always do, with some introduction. So Anita, would you just mind introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about yourself, please?
Sure. Hi. So I'm a faculty member in the Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of Western Ontario, and I've been focused on knowledge translation and what we call integrated knowledge translation or research co-production, specifically for probably the last maybe 5 years. Well, for a long time, more than 5 years, I'd say, for the whole thing, the knowledge translation and the research co-production for a very long time. I'm quite fascinated with the topic. So I teach knowledge translation at a graduate level, but I also do research in the area.
Okay, great. Liz?
Liz Fletcher, qualified OT, worked in mental health services for quite a number of years now. The last couple of years I've been more focused on QI, quality improvement, and I am involved in this because I think co-production is the way forward.
Right, thanks, Liz. And my name's Rob Copeland. I'm director of the Advanced Wellbeing Research Centre here in Sheffield University. Always forget to introduce myself in these things. So, Joe, over to you. And then, Joe, perhaps I could ask you at the end of your introduction, as you did so well last week, just to summarise kind of where we've got to in this sort of conversation so far, if that'd be okay.
I'll give it a go. So I'm Joe Langley. I'm a design engineer and researcher in Lab for Living in Sheffield University. My interest is in the application of design processes and practices within research and the field of healthcare and well-being generally to create change, and using those practices and processes to engage non-researchers in those processes to enhance that ability to make change, I guess. So as you said, this is the third kind of recorded conversation that we've had. We started off 2 weeks ago sort of with the definitions of co-production, or a definition of co-production, and also bring into attention the sort of vagueness around the both definition and interpretation of co-production. And I use the term elasticity, the elasticity this creates with how people can interpret it. But also, I think picking up on sort of differences between collaboration and co-production, and the ability to, with that elasticity, to misuse the term co-production. And Ollie Williams' paper came up where he talked about the co-ubiquity, where everything is now labelled as co-production. And we were fortunate enough to be able to drag Ollie into the conversation last week as well. So that kind of led on nicely. And he kind of expanded on those points of co-ubiquity and that kind of elasticity to really talk a little bit about how the origins of the whether it's co-production, co-creation, co-design, coming from that kind of very democratic moral imperatives, have gradually become embedded within structures and almost reverted to this kind of top-down system-led thing where you must do co-production, which in a sense has kind of slightly distorted some of the motivations or incentives for why people do it, which doesn't help that kind of use of the co-ubiquity. So people now doing it because they have to rather than because they want to. And understanding the sort of moral imperatives. And I think that was an interesting reflection that kind of following on this kind of muddling of language between imperatives and benefits and rationale. So the moral bit is an imperative. We must involve people because they have a human right to these things that we do for their benefit and that they have a human right to be involved. But the technocratic stuff isn't an imperative. It's a benefit of these processes, which creates two rationales, a technocratic rationale and a democratic rationale. But the imperative is the moral, the democratic one. And I think that's kind of really important distinction to kind of set out with these collaborative forms of working.
No, that's great. I think that's kind of landed us in a really, a really sort of interesting place to pick it up with you, Anita. And so, what are your views on the kind of, why? Let's start off with the why co-production. What's your view about, well, why co-production? And perhaps we could then unpack some of the language that's used around it. But the heart of it, why would we do this, or why might we consider it?
I think it's a great place to start. But even before we get there, I do want to say that my comments are limited to my knowledge and experience with research co-production, right? So that's involving non-research partners in the development and execution of a research project. So I do want to anchor my comments in that. Although I have been involved in some broader projects, which I can maybe bring in a little bit later. But so why do it? I mean, it really does go back to the same reason, which is you ought to be involving people in the research who are going to be affected by it. But being affected by it can happen in a couple of ways. One can be affected through health services, but the other way could be, well, they're paying through their taxes in our publicly funded systems and systems of research, right? And so there's also that accountability issue in terms of having people involved, because in fact, this is their money and this is their tax money, and why wouldn't they be involved? But I also do take up the point and believe in the idea that those who are involved in the research and those ought to be those who are also being affected by the research. And that probably reflects the kind of work that I've been doing, which is around the organization of health services, as opposed to individual clinical treatments, for example.
Okay. And you mentioned in your introduction a couple of phrases that I think are new to the conversation for us, but kind of add to the richness of how we describe co-production. You talked about integrated knowledge translation, and then you also talked about research co-production. And so, are they the same? How are they different? Are they the same, or how would you kind of communicate those two phrases, if indeed I've listened and actually got them right?
Right, and I've had to have these conversations with colleagues in the UK who, and some other colleagues from different countries who are using the co-production way of thinking about things, the integrated knowledge translation way of thinking about things. Originated in Canada, and so some of these conversations have melded as we've been working together on research projects. And so integrated knowledge translation is about working with those working with those non-research partners who have the ability to then influence the implementation of those findings. So with integrated knowledge translation, there is a real eye to making sure or trying to support the implementation of findings that come out of a research project. And with research co-production, I think that that's still part of the aim there. From what I can see when I'm interacting with my colleagues, research co-production is still about involving non-researchers in the research process. I think that there is a stronger emphasis on who those people are depending on which country you're coming from. So with the UK, you've done a tremendous job of focusing on patient and public involvement. There's been 10 years of support through various organizations. and through funding agencies, right, through requirements of funding agencies, so, which speaks to that technical motivation. Whereas in Canada, we have only recently been focused in on the patient or the public, and the focus has been instead on involving health managers or policymakers, health system leaders as partners in the research process to make sure that the research question is of benefit to both the system, the program, as well as to the scientific community.
Mm. And you mentioned, last question for me, because this is really interesting, you mentioned that sort of as partners in this. What does that term partners in this mean to you, Anita? Because we use that phrase a lot. You know, we work in partnership with everybody, don't we? And but what do we actually mean by that? Interesting. What's your view on it?
Well, what we hope it means, you know, what the integrated knowledge translation idealized view would be, is that you are actually sharing decision making through a research project with your partners. That may be different than what plays out on the ground. And I say this as, like right now, I'm actually reviewing grant applications. That's up on my upstairs computer. Walk down, and what I actually see when authors are calling this is an integrated knowledge translation project. I see a range from consultation. I have an advisory group that I'm going back to. You know, do you like this? Do you like that? Are we doing this well? Can you give us some advice about dissemination? So I'm seeing consultation. I'm seeing maybe deeper participation in the research in some sense. Perhaps they were involved in identifying research priorities or research questions. Perhaps they'll be involved in identifying some dissemination venues or approaches once the research is done. But then when I talk about shared decision making, again, this idealized version, what we're trying to strive towards, it's this situation where in fact your research partners are there because of the expertise that they hold, and that decision making about what's this data collection tool going to look like is equal decision making, right? So around the table, their point of view isn't advice, but it's actually an important part of that conversation. Their point of view holds equal power to my point of view around what that data collection tool, for example, might look like. And that shared decision-making extends to actually data collection, and it extends to interpretation of data, which involves some interesting ethical issues to work through, which we can talk about later. Mm-hmm. But that's kind of what we see as the ideal version of research co-production or integrated knowledge translation, where we're actually sharing that decision making throughout the execution of the research project.
Mm-hmm. And for me, it really underlines the importance of the intent. You know, to get to that stage, it's the intent with which you are pursuing an approach of co-production, because you know, if it's on an agenda that says actually, you know, the funder requires that I have some interaction with people outside my research team in order to get the funding, you know, the intent is slightly different than we fundamentally believe that there needs to be a shared decision about what this intervention looks like or how we shape it. And, you know, that kind of spectrum. We talked about it in quite crude terms offline last week between PPI and a version of it through to sort of co-production and in its truest sense, really. And I mean, how I guess, you know, Liz, what does that kind of feel like? Have you been in that sort of scenario where you've been, you know, through your experiences of co-production, really felt like you are actually making shared decisions in the process? Is there any examples that jump out to you, and what do they do that made it feel like that?
Well, I've actually only recently been involved in a sort of a research project whereby the researchers were sort of leading and wanting sort of a shared sort of co-produced process. So I was the clinician as part of that, and actually got involved and supported the research team to get people with lived experience involved, and actually kind of also try to add my quality improvement skills as well to that process. And so I don't know whether it's the same as what you're talking about in terms of integrated knowledge translation, but sort of my experience was that it felt quite new. I'd not been asked to be involved in that sort of situation before, but it actually felt really, really good and valuable. I got something from it personally as a clinician or a QI member. There was positive feedback from all the sort of people with lived experience of mental illness about it. But you know, I keep on harping on about this with in this podcast sort of series. But for me, it was because it was really well planned. The co-production as part of the large research project was very, very much valued, and a big proportion of their budget was put towards this. So it was very well planned, very well done. We were informed not only of the research project, but why they were doing it, and also what they hope to get out of it, and how we could contribute going forward. And I have to say, it was absolutely brilliant. But for me, that's the first time I've been involved in such a large project. And I've been a clinician for more than 10 years, and so I suppose I just hope that there's more to come, and all I can do is compliment that process. But how common that is, I'm not quite sure, and I don't think it is that common. And but for me, it's the way to support clinicians to understand the research process, and what we all want from the outcomes and that shared decision making, and actually change services together. For me, is hugely important, and what's really missing across the majority of healthcare.
Can I ask, Liz, with going back to what Anita said about about the involvement in decision making and not just in a kind of overarching process, but also in the detailed activities. So maybe designing data collection tools and even getting involved in collecting data and interpreting data, etc. In your experience of that project that you've just described, how much were both you in your kind of representing your clinical role, but also the patient participants, the people with lived experience that you help to recruit into that participatory roles as well? How much were you and them involved in those kind of individual steps?
So there's only been a couple of sessions, and they were very much around designing the research question. And, and so it was, I'm hopeful that will just continue, and there will be involvement. They were very much, I felt as the research team were very much open to shaping things with, being very collaborative. And I think this is a really good example, but a rare example.
Anita, sorry, Liz, go on.
No, it's fine. I finished.
Anita, have you got some examples from your work where that's sort of where it's worked really well? Any kind of particular areas or studies that you think actually no, that shared decision making was really apparent, and what enabled that? What were some of the kind of strategies that worked well in that, do you think, or maybe what doesn't work so well?
That's a great question. We are at the tail end of a 2-year study, and it's actually co-production in general. It's not so much research co-production, but it's a really great example where we've been working with the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Canada, so a national funder, major national funder, and 2 years ago they wanted to create a new structure. And the structure was a new kind of advisory body, and they were to come up with, and there was about 13 of them, depending on the different conditions under heart and stroke, and their their job was to come up with some strategic themes for heart and stroke to be thinking about as they were moving forward. But what was really key about this was these different, like 12 or 13 different condition-focused bodies were structured in such a way that they did facilitate collaboration between clinical folks, researchers, persons with lived experience, and there were a couple of other types of stakeholders in there, like policymakers. But there were some really interesting markers that it went well that we studied. And for example, we could see the language as it shifted over the 2 years. And at the beginning, that language was us and them, right? So those who traditionally had the power in those kind of advisory committees would have been the clinical researchers. They would have been the ones kind of setting some of those research priorities. And all of a sudden they were sharing that with this wider group of people. And it was us and them, us and them. And at the end of year one, we started seeing in our transcripts, we did this, we did that, right? And so that was really wonderful to see. And just that we didn't see the us and them anymore.
It was really as stark. It was really as stark as that. It was kind of the, us and them, and then that real sort of transition. That's really.
Oh yes, you could see it. You could see it in the way that they were talking about their individual advisory groups. But the other enabling factor in that process was it was incredibly resource intensive for heart and stroke. And yes, they had to do a lot of the things that you think you would have to do, lots of extra phone calls to support the actual meetings, making sure that the documents were provided way ahead of time, all that kind of stuff. But there was a governance model for each of those committees that I think made a real difference. It was a co-chair model of a clinical researcher as well as one of the community members. And by community members, I mean a person with lived experience, or it could have been a caregiver or another community member, but maybe not with lived experience. But and so I think even that going in signaled something very, very important to the community. So those are some small examples, I think, of where we saw success in terms of collaboration and in terms of the themes that came out afterwards, and in the work that came out, and we could see that in the language. But there were a couple of things there that were enabling, such as that co-governance model.
There's something really, I think, really important about these. It goes to Rob's going to like this, Dave Brailsford's aggregation of marginal gains. So that's from cycling sports stuff in the UK, where you make tiny little benefits in, if you make tiny little benefits in a multitude of different areas, then the cyclist can go faster rather than focusing just on one area. But I think it's the same with creating these conditions, the right conditions, I call them, for co-production to happen. It's not one thing in my experiences. It's been a kind of a number of little signals. So the co-chairing model is a great example of one of those things which immediately makes a statement. But the surrounding kind of, even the environment in which, the environment in which these things, these meetings, these research projects are traditionally held, speak volumes about who has the power. So even, taking them out of those environments and putting them elsewhere. And I just wondered if, again, from your experiences, thinking about that, kind of all the little things that might bring up and attribute or amplify the kind of signals that level these and engage people properly. You talked about an ideal kind of IKT or co-production model. And I kind of got the impression that whilst it's an ideal, it might be perceived as being unobtainable, or kind of really, there's so many variables and factors that can be against that. And I just wondered if you could kind of maybe tell us a little bit about some of those things which might prevent us reaching towards that ideal, and also some of those little things that actually help us reach. So I guess the barriers and enablers, what are the kind of, in your experiences, those little details that can either get in the way of or really help to kind of achieve these co-production projects?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know if I'm taking the conversation in a different direction, Joe, but I've often been thinking about this ideal co-production, and are we treating that term in the wrong way? Like, are we expecting partnering to be the same if all the facilitators and barriers were ideal, if they were in place, if there was resources, and if there was appropriate governance, and if there was support from leadership, if there was a common vision, if there was trust. So those are some of the facilitators that we're seeing in the literature. Would we, so one of the question that I've been asking about that is, if we had those facilitators and we dampened the challenges, would we see the same kind of partnering? Would we see the same kind of collaboration? Are we expecting too much? Like, is there some kind of archetype that we are feeling like we're trying to impose? And what are the different kinds of, like, what should we be expecting? So I've been kind of playing around with this, and Ollie brings up quite thoroughly, this idea that, well, maybe in fact there's, not maybe, there are different structures and contexts of research, and those structural things, in fact, where I'm taking that is that those structural things actually might produce or might manifest in one kind of partnering relationship. But maybe partnering relationships actually look very different in different fields, right? And so maybe the idealized partnering relationship in environmental science might actually be very different than the idealized partnering relationship in health services, and it might look very different in a different field, right? So kind of wondering, I've been wondering about that. Are we putting too much emphasis on a perfect archetype of a partnering relationship or a co-production relationship? And then, so thinking about, as Ollie's pointed out, him and his colleagues, like different structural conditions, what does that do to what that partnership looks like? What about the field of research, as I've just said, what does that look like? But what about the type of research study? Like, different types of research study may, in fact, put constraints on what kind of partnering is possible. So maybe an epidemiological study might look very different than a qualitative study. So, I've just been kind of playing around with that idea. Like, are we putting too many constraints on ourselves when we think about this archetype? So I'd be curious about what you both think about that.
Yeah, I mean, just for the record, Joe's been struggling with internet connection, so he's not just disappeared because he's had enough, folks. He has literally had a nightmare with his thing. I mean, I've got some thoughts on it, but Liz, do you have any immediate reflections on that?
Can you hear that? Is that? Oh, sorry, I'm getting a FaceTime incoming. Yes. Yeah, I suppose. I think there are. I'm going to talk about skills again of the facilitator, aren't I? I think, like you've alluded to, there's, maybe there are certain conditions that we need to get absolutely right, but we obviously need to adapt to whether it's the local environment, whether it's a type of study, whether it's a particular subject, and I think we're all just sort of learning about that as we go, aren't we? And I think, I've been involved in a number of different co-production experiences now, and with different facilitators, and I've, and they've all been, pretty good, but they've all also been very different. And I also think there's something about, I remember the first one I ever was involved with. It was developing a charity, Sheffield Flourish, and it was very much rooted in co-production, and it kept on coming up. There's got to be a flat platform. That's what everyone kept on saying. There's got to be a flat platform, and people people with lived experience were used to introducing themselves as, I'm somebody with lived experience. And we all talked about that, and actually that kind of creates that division straight away. And so we talked about how we can, you know, let's just introduce ourselves in terms of what we enjoy. And I think that openness, I think we still need that in co-production sort of sessions now, is to talk openly about, actually we don't know how to get it right at the moment, and there might be some mistakes, and we might trip up, and I think we've got to be forgiving as participants, as well as having good quality facilitators as well. You know, it's a kind of, we're all in this together, and what we might experience through this process is ups and downs, and actually we might go through some difficulties here, but I think that's part of the process. And I think we've got to, I think being open and honest, I'm sure that's in the literature somewhere about kind of creating that atmosphere, but yeah.
And I know Ros Davies is going to join us for a conversation in August as well about some of her Sheffield Flourish work, so we can kind of dig into that a bit. I mean, my view on a lot of this is I think it's more about how it feels than structurally how we plan it. And I think, you know, when you were talking, Anita, about the narratives that you had heard in your discourse about the shift from us and them to we, I think there would also have been, I don't know if you were actual observations in the room, but there would have also, I think, been a shift in the atmosphere and the way that it probably felt to be part of that process, just as much as what people said, but how they interacted with one another and the dynamics. And I think so much of the planning for me within the co-production process is about trying to, as Joe describes, trying to create those conditions, not so much that people, what they say, but actually how the process feels. You know, that opportunity to contribute. How do we create that, intentionally create that through our actions and through our planning and through some of the structures? And, you know, Liz, you gave a lovely example there about, we come with it with an identity that we almost feel so precious about. I've, you know, worked for 25 years in academia. I'm going to introduce myself as professor, you know, but actually what am I interested in? You know, if I could get paid to ride my bike, I'd rather be doing that. So, you know, for me, if you give people an opportunity to talk about what matters most to them as part of their introduction, it really changes the feel of that, of the process, just as much as, you know, asking the right questions does, or the structure of the narrative. And that's partly my thoughts on it, really, as much as how it feels as to kind of the structure of it, really.
I think that just to pick up when you talked about the us and them kind of feeling, it's, you know, in clinical practice, when you're in that sort of traditional setting where things aren't co-produced, it's really evident that we're working in that kind of silo, when we're having kind of conversations that are just about that kind of professional practice. And actually, when you're so much, when your experience is there, and actually you go into a co-production experience, it's a very different feel. And I think that's something that, as a professional, I don't know whether from a researcher point of view as well, it's kind of something that you also have to learn about, kind of going through that process yourself. And actually, if you've been working for 10 years as a researcher or as a clinical, you know, as an OT or whatever, a nurse or whatever, you're used to working in a certain way. And actually, you have to learn about that process as well, as to actually how that feels to become that we, and feel that as part of that co-production experience as well.
Yeah. Anita, we have you for 2 more minutes. Again, on my clock. So one of the are there any sort of risks that you would want to highlight to this sort of approach? Anything that, you know, we really need to keep our eyes on when it comes to sort of research co-production or IKT? Anything that you would highlight to close? Or
I think everybody would agree that it takes a lot of resources, right? And so to mitigate that risk, I mean, I don't know if that's quite a risk, but I mean, it could be a risk in terms of your academic promotion, because it takes a lot of time, right? So there's sort of risks that kind of tumble out of the need for a lot of resources. And to mitigate that, I would just sort of say, you know, work in that time, make sure that you've got enough time to be working one-on-one with some of the people that may need more information or may benefit from more explanation before the formal meeting. Ensure that you have got the financial resources to be able to support someone's time to participate meaningfully, whether it means paying for childcare or paying for their time, or so I think, you know, if we had a better sense, if we were able to, or if we were able to really work in the resources that are required, and we were able to be successful in securing funding for some of those resources, I think that could go a long way to mitigating some of the risks.
There's an interesting point there, I think, about the resource intensity of these processes, which goes back to one of the very first conversation we had, Rob, and your challenging question about the long-term benefits and outcomes of this. Because in theory, by doing it this way and making it easier to implement and easier to use, you save resources further downstream. So this idea that actually it is more resource intensive, I think we have to acknowledge, yes, it is up front, but we also have to argue, and until evidence proves otherwise, I'm going to continue to argue this, that actually over the life course, in terms of value for money, in a sense, for pound invested in research, in terms of evidence use and so on, this actually comes out as something which is more cost effective. Because at the moment, the uptake of research evidence and so on, we all know this, is really poor. So if we increase that by working in this way, then actually there is a overall a kind of cost saving or benefit in the longer term. And I think that's something we have to kind of bring to the conversation, because all methods of health research are resource intensive. Let's be honest. I mean, clinical trials aren't cheap. So I think it shouldn't be something which we kind of continuously address in a kind of negative way. Just acknowledge it and say, yeah, but there is also this added value in terms of the benefits and outcomes. And
I think, Joe, you've identified actually one of the studies that is absolutely waiting to be done there for me. So if anybody's watching, there's 4 of us here who I think are in for that question. Dan's not in, so he's obviously missing out on this one. So unlucky, Dan. But Anita, thank you. We could carry on talking forever, but I know you've got to go. You know, I want to kind of just honour that in terms of your time. So thank you so much for agreeing to come on. We may kind of have a part 2 with you if that's okay. There's so much more we'd like to explore, but just for now, thanks so much for giving up your time, and we wish you well for the rest of your day, whatever that involves. So thanks very much for being part of this conversation.
And thanks for the invitation. It's been fun.
No, thank you. I echo Rob's point. It's been great to have you down here, and I've got so many more questions. It'll be really good to have another opportunity to kind of take the conversation further. I know Dan was sorry to miss you with booking his holiday for this week. He was escaping the confines of his home at the first opportunity that he could with his family. So
I don't blame him.
No, not at all. But I know he had loads of things he wanted to kind of discuss with you and questions for you. So if you do have time, it would be great to see you again.
Okay, wonderful. Great. Nice to meet you all.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.
See you later.